Hey guys, it's Katie. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about my favorite books that I read this year. I really like to look back at my reading stats at the end of the year, but I've decided to separate that from this video. So today we're just going to be talking about my top 10 books that I read this year. Originally I tried to put them in order, but I kind of had a tie for the top slot among like 5 of these books. So I'll have them all linked down below in the description if you want to go check them out. Obviously I highly recommend. If you're new to my channel, hi, welcome. My name is Katie. I'm an indie author and a freelance editor. I have 3 books out currently. It would make my day if you wanted to pick one of them up. You can get them anywhere books are sold, including on Scribd if you have a membership over there, and my 4th book is coming out March 30th of 2021. If you're also a writer, then this might be of interest to you because Campfire is actually sponsoring today's video. I've talked about Campfire a few times on my channel in the past. I absolutely love their softwares, especially their newest product, Campfire Blaze, which is actually how I'm going to be outlining and writing my next book, which I'm going to be starting next month. So keep an eye out for that video. I'm gonna have a link down below in the description. You should definitely go check them out. Basically, Campfire Blaze is designed to help you write stories faster. It includes a word processor, it has character sheets, timelines, locations, maps, relationships, character arc, magic systems, a million things that you could think of to help you plan and write your story. What's really cool about Campfire Blaze is you can build your own subscription, so you're only paying for the features that you know you want to use. You can collaborate in real time with other writers, like if you're co-writing something. They have a 30-day money-back guarantee as well, so it's totally risk-free. So make sure to check that link down below in my description if you want to try them out. I can't recommend them highly enough. I'm super excited to use their software to write my next book. But without further ado, let's just get straight into the books. So the first one that I want to talk about kind of just goes for this whole series that I got introduced to this year, and I'm so glad that I found these books. The first one is called A Quick Bite by Lindsay Sands. This is a paranormal romance series that follows a different member of this Arjano family in each book. I listened to the first 4 books in the series on audio this year, and they were all so much fun. The perfect kind of thing to get you out of a reading slump. If you like vampires and paranormal romance, I think you'll really like these. If you also appreciate like satire style books, like they're clearly not meant to be taken seriously, and the ridiculousness of them is kind of what I liked the most. I found them super funny. The first book in the series, the opening scene starts with this guy at a bar shoving a cucumber down his pants to try to attract girls, if that kind of gives you the vibe of the books. And in this first book, we're following Lysandra, who's a member of this vampire family, except she has a severe phobia of blood. She faints at the sight of it, which makes feeding for her kind of difficult. So her mom tries to hire a therapist to help her through this phobia of hers, and it ends up being a romance between her and her therapist, basically. I'm so glad that I picked up this series this year. They were just so fun and lighthearted and easy to listen to when I wasn't in the mood to read. Highly recommend if you like paranormal romance. In a similar vein, you might be surprised by this one. The next book on my list is the Charlie Travesty serial by AJ Sutton and Jesse Elliott, I believe. So the first volume of this serial is currently out. The second volume is coming out, and there's 4 parts to the first volume, and they're each like 100 pages long. This one is also like a vampire paranormal romance, and if you've been staying caught up on my videos while I was reading these books, I loved the first part. I was a little disappointed with the way that the story ended up going, but still I'm putting it here in this list of my favorites because I was in such a mood for vampire books this year. That was just what I was looking for. I wanted something trashy and fun and steamy and just to bring me back to like Vampire Diaries, Twilight feels from when I was a teenager, and I got that with this series. I loved the world building in here, and I was so highly invested in this series immediately, and I couldn't really put my finger on why. Our main character's name is Charlie. She's a travesty, which means she's a part of this royal family. She's a princess, very privileged, has never had a care in the world, and basically what happens in this world is when vampires come of age, their eye color changes, and that kind of determines where they end up in society. So she's really hoping for like green eyes. It's gonna put her in this part of society that she wants to be in. However, when she wakes up, she has lavender eyes, which is a sign that she's half human, and they're called lavenders. They're basically the most hated beings in society. You could literally murder one of them and it wouldn't be against the law. So she gets cast out of her family and has to figure out how to survive. I loved the tone and the vibe of this series. I flew through all 4 parts probably faster than anything else that I've read this year. I was pretty much addicted. Loved the characters, loved the world. I definitely had my issues with it and where the plot decided to go and how I thought some plot points felt kind of forced. All of this is to say though, like I had all of these issues with it, and it's still something that I think of as one of my favorite things that I've read this year. This one has a very different tone from the first one, A Quick Bite, even though they are both vampire paranormal romances. The first one is more like ridiculous, funny, kind of quirky. This one was darker, angstier, steamier, so very different vibes for these two. Actually, I take that back. I wouldn't say steamier. The first series has lots of sex in it too, but this one I just think it has like a darker tone. On a totally different note, another one of my favorite books that I read this year was The How and the Why by Cynthia Hand. This is a young adult contemporary, and it's about a girl who was adopted when she was a baby. When she turns 18, she's informed by the state that her mother had written her some letters that she now has access to. Now she thinks she wants to look into her mother and figure out who she was. So we're following her story as she's a senior in high school. She's getting ready for college. Her mom is really sick and in the hospital, and she's going through all of the typical high school, like worrying about how she's going to afford college, where does she want to go to college, friendship, boy drama, all that kind of stuff. And then we also have chapters from her birth mom's perspective when she was a teenager, because I think she gave birth to her when she was like 16, and she's at this school with all pregnant girls. And basically, to sum it up, this is not like my taste in books at all, but I absolutely loved this one. I found it so wholesome and cute and touching, and I just genuinely really enjoyed it. It's a really long book as far as contemporary goes, by my standards at least, but it didn't feel super long to me at all. If you're just looking for like a happy feel-good book, would really recommend this one. Next on my list, I have A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson. I have a whole like 24-hour reading vlog from when I was reading this book on my channel. This is a young adult thriller, and usually I'm not a huge fan of young adult thrillers. I love adult thrillers, that's my favorite genre by far, but I always find young adult thrillers to be kind of a disappointment, and this one just really pleasantly surprised me. We're following our main character Pip. She's doing a school project, and she's looking into an old case from her small town where the pretty and popular girl who was a few years older than her went missing, but her body was never found. And basically the whole town just kind of assumed that Andy, the pretty and popular girl's boyfriend, did it, and then he went on to kill himself. Pip thinks that's not what happened. She wants to look more into it, and quickly as she starts to investigate, she starts getting those, you know, ominous stop looking messages. So obviously there's something more to it. The main reason I picked up this book is because everyone told me you're never going to guess the ending, and I feel like I'm pretty good at guessing the ending for thrillers, so I was like, okay, bet, we gotta read it now. And I couldn't guess it. There were so many twists at the end. Like, you might be able to guess one or two of them, but there's just like so many one after the other. There's no way you're gonna be able to guess all of them, which is like my favorite part of a thriller, or like the twist endings. This one was really fun. Highly recommend listening to it on audiobook as well, because it's kind of that like multimedia format, so it has these sound effects and just a lot of really cool features. Would highly recommend. My next favorite was Tell Me Lies by Carola Levering. This is marketed as like an adult romance, but it's more of like a new adult coming of age story, I'd say. It's about our main character Lucy, and it switches off timelines from when she's in college and she meets a boy Steven, and they have this severely toxic, like on again off again, I wouldn't even call it a relationship, it's like a situationship. And then we jump forward to, I think it's like 5 years later, after they've all graduated and they've all come together for one of their friends' weddings. This book was so messed up, and I talked about this a lot when I was reading it, so I'm sorry if you're sick of hearing about it, but if you've ever been in a similar situation, I think you will love this book and you'll identify with it so much. If you've never been in this kind of situation, I think you will hate this book and be so annoyed with the characters, and just I wouldn't recommend reading it. But from everyone that I've talked to, who I recommended the book to and then they went on to read it, who had been in a similar situation, we were all like, oh my god, this book. So it was like a bonding moment for all of us. But if you've never been through like a really toxic on again and off again relationship, the characters make horrible decisions, super stupid, never learn, so frustrating to read, so you probably won't like it. But still, one of my favorites that I've read this year. Highly recommend if you're the right audience for it. My next favorite was one of my most anticipated books for the year, so like I knew this was going to be on this list, was Home Before Dark by Riley Sager. This is an adult thriller that kind of borderlines on horror, or at least it's just more of a creepy thriller. I personally love Riley Sager. I know he's kind of a hit or miss with thriller readers, but I really like his books. And Home Before Dark, the best way I can describe it, is very similar to The Haunting of Hill House, if you saw that on Netflix. But also people who haven't read it, who hear the description, they're like, oh, that sounds just like A Haunting of Hill House, then they brush it off. But I do feel like they're very different stories. Our main character's name is Maggie, and her father is an author, and he wrote a non-fiction book about her childhood when they lived in this house for like 1 week. And it was so haunted and bad things were happening, so they like fled in the middle of the night and never went back. So he wrote a book about their experience in this house, and this book has followed Maggie her entire life. Like, everyone recognizes her as a little girl from the book. She was like 6 years old when this was happening, and this has caused like a major divide in her family. She hates that her dad profited off of this book because she doesn't think any of this actually happened. She thinks he's lying and calling it nonfiction when he just made it all up. And then also she feels like the way that he portrayed her in the book isn't accurate to like who she is as a person. So basically when her father dies, she inherits this haunted house and she goes back there to basically flip it and sell it. I read this book around Halloween and I just really loved the spooky, creepy vibes. If you're reading it and you're not loving it at first, I would recommend sticking with it, because like halfway through, maybe 3/4 of the way through, I thought I had everything figured out. I was like, oh, this is kind of disappointing. I was expecting more considering I liked his other books so much, and I loved the twists at the end. I loved the way that this turned out. This definitely seems to be a hit or miss with people, but I personally loved it. I think his books are a great place to start if you're new to thrillers and you want to get into them. This one is definitely my favorite of his so far. I also really liked Lock Every Door, and his new book, Survive the Night, is coming out next summer. It's my most anticipated release of next year, so highly recommend his books if you haven't tried them yet. Next on the list, we have a romance book, Beach Read. I loved this book. This was so cute and so fun. It was making me smile so much, but it also had a lot more depth and like heavy subject matter in here than you would expect from like the cutesy cover. But I liked that about it. I liked that it had more depth to it. Basically, it's about two writers who are falling in love. Our main character's father passes away and she inherits his beach house, so she goes to stay there while she's struggling with writer's block to write her next book. And it turns out her like arch nemesis from college has the beach house next to her, and he's also struggling with writer's block. So they kind of start to befriend each other, and they like challenge each other to try and help each other get out of the writer's block that he's gonna write in her genre. She writes like cutesy romance books and he writes like really serious literary fiction, so they're each gonna try to write a book in the other's genre. I loved this book. I thought it was super cute. I was smiling the whole time. It was very like feel good. It was exactly what I needed at that point in my life. I've heard other people say that they didn't like her writing style. I really liked it. I thought, to me, it was just that slightly funny kind of writing style that's virtually invisible, honestly. Like, you don't really pay much attention to the writing, but it has that little comedic edge to it, if that makes any sense. I really liked this one. If you're just looking for a feel-good, fun romance, I would recommend it. I think part of the reason why I loved it so much is maybe because I'm also a writer. These last three are definitely all tied for #1. I think these three are my favorites that I've read this year. So first we have City of Girls by Elizabeth Gilbert, and if any of these are gonna like break out just like a little bit and be like the top favorite, I think it's this one. I absolutely adored this book. If you're gonna read any of these recommendations, highly recommend this one, especially if you've never read a book by Elizabeth Gilbert. I think this would be a great introduction to her books for you. Highly recommend the audiobook. This is definitely one of those more like atmospheric books that's more character driven rather than plot driven, so I wouldn't go into it expecting it to be like really fast paced. It's really about the character development of our main character. Her name is Vivian. The book is set in the 1940s, and we're basically following her life from when she's a young adult and she fails out of college and she becomes this like party girl in New York City through her entire life, and she's like in her 90s, and the book is set with this kind of structure where Vivian is telling us this story when she's like in her 90s. She's actually writing a letter to someone who we don't know who they are, but she's writing a letter to a man's daughter to explain who that girl's father was to her. And I don't know, I'm sorry if that was confusing, but basically Vivian is this like promiscuous party girl all throughout her young adulthood, so you don't know who the man is gonna be who she's talking about. You also don't know what he's going to be to her. I loved the setting with the 1940s in New York City. I loved Vivian's character development. Is just really interesting to witness because she goes through some like drastic ups and downs, and then there's also that little mystery of like, who is she talking about? Like, who is this man going to be? That's just kind of intriguing all in the background. I love Elizabeth Gilbert's writing style. I think she's a beautiful writer. This story was just so like engaging. Like, I was fully swept up in this story for like the couple of days that it took me to read it. It's definitely a longer book, and like I said, it's slower paced, very character driven, but also very atmospheric and fun if you like the setting. But I would go into this with some patience. I would get the audiobook. The audiobook was fabulous, and maybe like do something while you're listening to it. By far one of my favorite books that I've read this year. By far one of my favorite books that I've read ever. Loved it. Will be sticking with me for a long time. Cannot recommend enough. Hey guys, sorry if the whole frame just changed. I just took a break for an hour. My camera battery is dying, so we charged that. And they're also doing construction on my building, so I'm really hoping you can't hear that. I sat around waiting to see if they would stop, and they're not stopping anytime soon. And we only have 2 more books to get through, so I really hope you can't hear that in the background. If you can, I hope it's not too distracting. Next we have The Night Swim. This is another adult thriller, and I want to preface this by, I think that a lot of the subject matter in here might be triggering or just like really upsetting to some people to read. Our main character has this like true crime podcast where she dives back into old cases and basically lets the audience decide who's guilty or not guilty. And so this time around she is following a rape case while it's going on instead of after the fact. So we're following 2 storylines basically. this podcaster as she's covering a present day rape story and then also something that happened to a girl like 20 years before in the same town, which was another rape case. So obviously lots of trigger warnings for rape. It's not just one scene, although there are scenes of it happening, several of them, very upsetting scenes. There's also just like that undertone for the entire book. Like obviously it's a major theme of the book. So I found this book to be like super unsettling. It made me feel nauseous like the entire time I was reading it, but it was so well done. I loved the social commentary in here. I thought it was so smart, super engaging. I couldn't put it down even though it was making me feel sick. It was so deeply upsetting because I think it just like nailed the subject perfectly. How rape cases are handled differently than practically any other case in court, and how everything that happens after a rape is often just as traumatizing, if not more traumatizing to the victim than the actual event. How much like public opinion plays into it, and worrying about the guy's future. In the present day case, the kid, he might go to the Olympics as a swimmer, so everyone's like, you're gonna ruin his career and all of that kind of stuff. Very troubling book. Very important book, I think. Very well done. So if you can handle the subject matter, couldn't recommend enough. The audiobook was also fantastic because you switch back and forth between what's happening and then also hearing bits of her podcast, and it like sounds like you're listening to a podcast. Definitely was one of the most difficult books for me to read this year, but also I would say one of the most important books, so definitely recommend this one. And then finally, our last book to talk about today is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. This is a monster of a book. It's very long, very slow paced, very character driven, which surprisingly is actually the case for a lot of these books this year, but well worth it in my opinion, well worth it. Talk about the character development that we got to see with Vivian in City of Girls over her like 90 some years of life. This one we get, what, 300 years with Addie. She basically makes a deal with the devil, or just like one of the evil gods, in the 1700s in France to prevent her from going into a marriage that she wants nothing to do with. So he makes it so she can live forever, but nobody's going to remember her. So we follow her life through these 300 years and what that's like to not be remembered. And she can't own anything too. Like she can't put down any roots. She can't make any kind of impact on the world. People turn away from her and they immediately forget that they were just talking to her. She can't like find a place to live. She can't own any belongings. She wanted to be free is what she tells this god, and he takes it and runs with it. So now she's completely untethered and has like no connections in the world, and no one loves her and no one knows her. And basically the book is about what happens when she finally meets someone who remembers her. I loved it. It did drag a little bit in a couple of places for me. It's very long. Again, would recommend the audiobook. Overall, I really loved the ending. I found the ending so freaking satisfying. I really like V.E. Schwab's writing style. I think she has like a very pleasant, lyrical, enjoyable writing style. And again, the number one thing that I would recommend this book for is the character development. But I also really liked all of the different settings and all of the different places that Addie goes and all of the different time periods. I thought that was handled really well. The romance itself is cute. It's not my favorite aspect of the book though. And I did find not only Addie's character development to be very interesting, but also this like evil god who she made a deal with. His character development is very interesting because he comes to visit her once on her birthday every single year as like their anniversary. So we see him like periodically through the story over the years as he checks in with her, basically asking her like give up, because the deal was she can live as long as she wants, completely free, but then when she's done and she doesn't want to do it anymore, he gets her soul. So he's basically trying to make her life as miserable as possible in order for her to give up so he can have her soul, which is kind of what gets her through this really difficult time, because she's like super stubborn and she's like, no, I'm not gonna let him win. So relatable. This is definitely one of those books that's gonna be super memorable and stick with me for a really long time. I've never read anything like it. It's by far my favorite book that I've read by this author. Definitely worth the patience and the effort that it takes to get through this. It is long, it is a little bit slower paced and more character driven, but well worth it in my opinion. You have to read this book at some point. So those are all of my favorite books that I've read this year. I would love to hear down below in the comments what some of your favorites were, or if you've read any of the ones that I talked about today. If you want to pre-order The Anti-Relationship Year, my book that's coming out March 30th of 2021, I would be so appreciative. It's my favorite thing I've ever written. I'm so excited for it to come out. I'll have all the links down below in the description. If you're new here, maybe subscribe and stick around. I'd love to have you, and I'd love it if you give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. It helps out my channel a lot. I'm sorry, I'm like talking fast and trying to get to the end of this video because of that noise back there. It's really loud to me, so I'm sure the camera's picking up at least a little bit of it. But I'm about to go out of town, so I don't have another time that we can film this. I hope you don't mind how dysfunctional this year's favorites video was. But thanks for watching. I hope you guys are all doing well, and I will just see you guys in my next video very, very soon. Bye.
So hit me. So hit me. So hit me. First a confession. With you, I feel a connection. With